Good morning, everyone. Today we will discuss class breakdown by instructional area and learning continuum map reports. During this learning segment, we will focus on answering the key question: how will results inform instruction for students? We will also use the success criteria to guide our learning. Today, I will model and support analysis of the class breakdown reports and learning continuum. The class breakdown reports provide a visual representation of the range of RIT scores in your class. Students are grouped in blocks of 10 RIT points. The class breakdown by RIT report groups students by their overall score for the subjects. Instructional goal areas with higher standard deviations typically display students in more RIT ranges. The class breakdown by projected proficiency report provides aggregated projected proficiency on our state assessment, Georgia milestones, and groups students based on how they are likely to perform on the state assessment based on their current RIT scores and the state linking study. Beginning at 5th grade, the report provides projected proficiency for SAT and ACT. Students with similar RIT scores have demonstrated that they are at similar levels of instructional readiness. Let's look at this report closely. What are the main data elements? What do you see? Look at reading. How many RIT bands does the class span? What is the RIT range for the class? How might this report support flexible grouping? When viewing the class breakdown by RIT report online, clicking the name of a subject opens the class breakdown by goal for that subject. The class breakdown by goal report groups students by their RIT score in each of the instructional areas. The class breakdown by goal report groups students by their RIT score in each of the instructional areas. Now let's take a closer look at the class breakdown by goal report. How is it similar and different from the class breakdown by RIT? How might it be useful to see the subject area broken down in this format? What does the number in parentheses indicate for each student? Flexible grouping is a strategy that can make it easier to differentiate instruction. With students in 2 to 3 groups, a teacher can plan lessons or adaptations for each group instead of trying to plan for each individual student. The class breakdown by instructional area report provides a good starting place for grouping students based on academic readiness. Other considerations, such as classroom performance, should also factor into grouping decisions. Groups should be reviewed regularly, with students moving between groups as needed and based on the skills currently being addressed in class. Flexible grouping can happen within a single classroom, across a grade level, or across multiple grade levels. The class breakdown by instructional area report provides a good starting place for grouping students based on academic readiness. Now, let's review how we can use the class breakdown report in conjunction with the learning continuum. The learning continuum can be used to complement local curriculum by describing in general terms the zone of proximal development of all students within a particular RIT range. It provides skill statements likely within a student zone of proximal development that can help inform teacher planning for scaffolding and enrichment. The Learning Continuum test view shows levels of skills and concepts to reinforce, develop, and introduce with students based on their RIT score for each instructional and goal area. It allows for side-by-side comparisons between RIT ranges. Students are not tested on every skill in each band, but we can infer that the skills and concepts in the develop range are likely within the zone of proximal development for students scoring within range. The Learning Continuum class view shows skills and concepts to develop with groups of students based on 10-point RIT score bands that are likely appropriate for their zone of proximal development. Here are 3 things to know about the Learning Continuum. Number 1, learning statements provide you with an instructional starting point for describing the skills and concepts that are most ready to be introduced, developed, or reinforced along with a continuum of learning. Number 2, test and class views supply global and student-specific information for tailoring instruction. Number 3, MAP RIT scores get connected to skills and concepts students are ready to learn, helping you identify learning goals and targets so you can both share them with your students and parents, plus create more personalized lesson plans. Planning with the end in mind is an approach designed to ensure strong alignment of standards, instruction, and assessment. It is a process that supports teacher and student clarity regarding intended learning outcomes and promotes eliciting and using evidence of student learning to adjust plans based on student needs. Next, we'll review some planning considerations for ELA, math, and reading. Next, we'll review some planning considerations for ELA, math, and reading. In the second step, consider how you and your students will know they have achieved the intended learning by identifying the evidence you will accept and how you will collect it. This involves identifying or designing the formative and summative assessments you will use along the way to elicit, collect, and use evidence of learning to continually adjust your teaching. MAP growth data analysis fits in here. After you have planned for the rigor of your grade level, consult your MAP growth data to check in on where students are likely ready to learn relative to what you are trying to teach. Consider multiple data sources to confirm the scaffolding or enrichment needs you surface in MAP growth. For example, classroom formative data, teacher anecdotal data, curricular assessments, historical interim data, and other diagnostics. This is the time for you to make responsive adjustments to your plans based on student needs. The fourth step is all about instruction. Put your plan to work and use your formative practice to monitor and adjust the plan in real time based on how students progress. Be sure to make notes about the adjustments you make so that you can use these reflections to anticipate and proactively plan for potential student needs in the future. Although we are here today to learn about effective ways to use the MAP growth assessment as a tool for learning and increasing student motivation, there is nothing more impactful than using your expertise and classroom formative assessment practice in combination and involving students in the process at each step. Effective use of the formative assessment process requires students and teachers to integrate and embed the following practices in a collaborative and respectful classroom environment: clarifying learning, activating learners, eliciting and analyzing evidence, and providing actionable feedback. Now, you can see the full responsive planning process with each component part. As we established earlier, this approach is designed to ensure strong alignment of standards, instruction, and assessment. It is a process that supports teacher and student clarity regarding intended learning outcomes and promotes eliciting and using evidence of student learning to adjust plans based on student needs. It should save you precious instructional time since you will be proactively anticipating and planning for student needs. Let's take a moment to reflect on these questions. How does your planning process and use of data compare to responsive planning for instruction? What questions or wonders do you have? Now, let's look at step 3 of the responsive planning in action. Pretend you are a 6th grade ELA teacher who is teaching a unit to support close reading of the novel Lightning Thief in conjunction with various myths. During your planning for close reading, you determine one of the standards supportive of student grappling with the text complexity of this novel and myths is RL 6.2. You have planned your instruction and rigor of this 6th grade standard, and now you need to consult with your MAP growth data to see if your students are ready to access this planned instruction. In this case, because you are teaching fictional literary text, you will analyze the literature instructional goal area. You need to identify the writ bands of your students that span in this instructional goal area before going on to the learning continuum. After you navigate to the test view of the learning continuum and filter for the grade level standard you are teaching, you will now click on the 191 to 200 writ band in the tab section. Notice how it is a darker blue. Let's take a look at the information listed below the standard RL 6.2. You notice there are no learning statements listed in the 181 through 190 column. You notice there are learning statements listed in the 191 through 200 column and in the 201 through 210 column. What does this mean for your instruction? First, let's dig into what the data is telling us. The presence of learning statements indicates the conceptual difficulty of items associated with the identified RIT range and standard is likely in the associated student's zone of proximal development, signaling instructional readiness for planned instruction. The absence of learning statements indicates the conceptual difficulty of items associated with the identified RIT range and standard is likely above or below the associated student's zone of proximal development, signaling a need to confirm scaffolding or enrichment needs and make necessary adjustments to the planned instruction. Now you need to check on the remaining RIT bands. This time you will focus on the second 3 RIT bands. Again, you want to jot down the middle band 221 through 230 so you can remember where to click when you go to the Learning Continuum test view so that you can see all 3 RIT bands at once. I will click on the 221 through 230 RIT band in the tab section. Notice again how it is a darker blue. Let's take a look at the information listed below the standard RL 6.2. Notice there are learning statements listed in the 211 through 220 column and in the 221 through 230 column. Notice there are no learning statements in the 231 through 240 column. What does this mean for instruction? As we established previously, the presence of learning statements indicates the conceptual difficulty of items associated with the identified RIT range and standard is likely in the associated student zone of proximal development, signaling instructional readiness for planned instruction. The absence of learning statements indicates the conceptual difficulty of items associated with the identified RIT range and standard is likely above or below the associated student's zone of proximal development, signaling a need to confirm scaffolding or enrichment needs and make necessary adjustments to the planned instruction. Let's take a moment to reflect on the question that's before us. Based on what you've learned, what would you now describe as the benefits of using MAP growth data? Moving forward, how will you use your students' MAP growth data to better support their learning?